In the autumn of 1516, a man walked into the Lisbon counting house of the Merchant Guild carrying something wrapped in oilcloth. His clothes were worn but well cut, the kind that suggested former prosperity. His hands were stained with ink and copper salts. The merchants knew him. Ruí de Freitas, once the most celebrated cartographer in Portugal, now a ghost. He unwrapped the cloth. Beneath was a map. Not just any map, a masterpiece, hand-drawn on vellum, illuminated with gold leaf and cinnabar, depicting coastlines, wind roses, depth soundings, and an archipelago in the mid-Atlantic that promised to reshape the balance of power in Europe. The merchants leaned in. Their breath quickened. This was not simply geography. This was wealth. This was empire. This was victory over Spain. But there was one problem. The islands didn't exist. You've been told that the age of exploration was about courage and discovery, that sailors braved unknown seas to expand human knowledge, that maps were scientific instruments, neutral and objective. But maps were never neutral. In 16th century Europe, a map was a weapon. A map was a lie you could sell. A map was worth more than a fleet of ships, because a map determined where those ships would sail, what investors would fund, and which crown would claim dominion over territories that might not even be real. The Portuguese and Spanish empires were locked in a brutal contest for control of global trade routes. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 had split the undiscovered world between them with a single line drawn on parchment. Portugal controlled the eastern route to the spice-rich Moluccas via Africa and the Indian Ocean. Spain scrambled to find a western route. Every new island, every new coastline, every navigational advantage could tip the balance. And cartographers held the keys to that advantage. Maps were state secrets. Portugal's Casa de India guarded its charts like crown jewels. Cartographers who leaked information faced execution. Foreign spies paid fortunes for stolen maps. In this environment, Ruí de Freitas saw an opportunity, not to discover new worlds, but to invent them. What if I told you that one man nearly bankrupted Portugal's merchant elite with nothing but ink and imagination? What if the same psychological mechanisms that made phantom islands appear on maps for centuries were weaponized for deliberate fraud? What if revenge, genius, and desperation combined to create a deception so sophisticated that even the king believed it? In the next 20 minutes, you'll see how a disgraced cartographer engineered one of history's most audacious cons. You'll understand why his map was believable. You'll see how rational actors, merchants, nobles, sailors, even the crown, convinced themselves that a fiction was real. And you'll discover why this pattern of cartographic deception repeated for centuries. Because the incentives to believe were always stronger than the incentives to verify. In the early 16th century, Europe was experiencing a revolution in how it understood the world. For millennia, the Atlantic Ocean had been a barrier, a terrifying void beyond which lay only myth. But by 1500, that void was being filled with ink and ambition. Portuguese sailors had rounded Africa and reached India. Columbus had stumbled onto the Caribbean islands. Magellan would soon circumnavigate the globe. The world was expanding at a dizzying pace. But knowledge was fragmentary and jealously guarded. When a Portuguese fleet returned from the Moluccas laden with cloves and nutmeg, the pilots brought more than spices. They brought navigational data, latitude measurements, coastline sketches, wind patterns, reef locations. This information was compiled by the royal cartographers and locked away. To possess accurate geographic knowledge was to possess strategic power. Portugal's dominance rested on this information asymmetry. The route around Africa to Asia was profitable but dangerous. The journey took years. Ships were lost to storms, disease, and hostile encounters. The spice trade generated enormous wealth, but the risks were matched by the costs. Every voyage was a gamble, and every successful voyage reinforced Portugal's monopoly on the eastern route. Spain, meanwhile, was desperate. The Treaty of Tordesillas had granted them the Western Hemisphere, but what did that mean in practice? Columbus's islands produced gold, Yes, but not the cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg that fetched astronomical prices in European markets. Spain needed its own route to the Spice Islands, one that didn't cross Portuguese control waters. The race was on, and into this competition stepped not soldiers or sailors, but men who drew lines on parchment. The cartographic system had a fatal flaw. It relied on trust. When a sailor reported sighting an island, cartographers added it to maps. When a captain claimed to have calculated a latitude, it was recorded as fact. There was no systematic verification process. How could there be? The ocean was vast. Expeditions were expensive. And optical phenomena, fata morgana, fog banks, cloud formations, created illusions of land where none existed. Phantom islands littered the maps of the era. Antillia, the island of the seven cities, appeared on charts as early as 1424, based on nothing but Portuguese legend. Friesland, south of Iceland, persisted on maps for over a century despite never being visited. The Isle of Demons haunted the coast of Newfoundland, justified only by sailor superstitions. These are not deliberate frauds. They were mistakes, legends, and wishful thinking that calcified into accepted geographic fact. The system was vulnerable because verification was harder than fabrication. To prove an island didn't exist, you had to sail to its supposed location and search the empty ocean. To prove it did exist, you only needed a convincing story and a map. The burden of proof favored the optimist, and this created an environment where fraud could thrive. Portugal's cartographic elite were not fools, but they operated under enormous pressure. The crown demanded results. Merchants demanded profits. Every expedition required investors who needed to believe the voyage would succeed. In this climate, skepticism was expensive. Belief was lucrative. And a talented cartographer with a grudge understood exactly how to exploit that dynamic. Ruí de Freitas had once been among Lisbon's most respected mapmakers. Trained in mathematics and astronomy, he had worked for the Casa de India, compiling data from returning expeditions. His maps were precise, his calculations reliable. He understood ocean currents, trade winds, and celestial navigation. He knew how maps were made and, crucially, how they were authenticated. But respect didn't translate to wealth or security. The cartographic profession was hierarchical and jealous. When Ruí produced a particularly innovative chart, one that synthesized years of Portuguese exploration into a comprehensive vision of the Indian Ocean, a rival claimed credit. The rival had noble connections. Ruí did not. The rival presented the map to the king and received a royal pension. Ruí received nothing. Worse, he was accused of indiscretion. Someone had leaked Portuguese navigation secrets to Spanish agents. Ruí was suspected, though never proven guilty. His reputation collapsed. The Casa de India dismissed him. Commissions dried up. He slipped into poverty, watching as lesser talents prospered on work he had pioneered. Ruí was not insane. He was calculating. He understood that in an era of incomplete knowledge and high stakes, the line between discovery and invention was thin. Explorers routinely embellished their findings to secure future funding. Phantom islands appeared on maps, not through malice, but through a combination of error, ego, and economic incentive. Ruí would simply take this dynamic to its logical extreme. He would create a discovery so compelling, so valuable, that investors would throw money at it. And by the time the truth emerged, he would be gone. The question wasn't whether he could create a convincing fake. The question was whether he could create a profitable one. The answer lay in understanding what made people believe. Ruí de Freitas spent months designing his masterpiece. This was not a crude forgery. It was a work of cartographic genius, deliberately constructed to exploit every cognitive bias and institutional weakness in the Portuguese maritime system. The map depicted a cluster of islands in the mid-Atlantic, roughly 3 weeks' sail west of the Azores. He called them the Ilhas das Especiarias, the Spice Islands, not the Moluccas, which Portugal already accessed via the Indian Ocean, but a different archipelago entirely. According to Rué's map, these islands lay at precisely 38 degrees north latitude, in a region where prevailing winds and currents made them accessible from Portugal, but difficult to reach from Spanish-controlled Caribbean routes. The genius was in the details. Rué didn't just draw coastlines. He included depth soundings showing navigable harbors. He marked fresh water sources. He drew trees that suggested tropical vegetation. He included indigenous place names, supposedly transcribed from Arabic traders who claimed the islands were known to North African merchants. He even invented a plausible discovery narrative. The islands had been sighted decades earlier by a Portuguese pilot who died before reporting them officially, leaving only a fragmentary journal that Rué had discovered in a monastery archive. This was where his expertise as a royal cartographer became lethal. He knew exactly what authentication markers would make the map credible. He aged the vellum with smoke and chemical treatments. He used period-appropriate pigments and binding techniques. He forged the signature of a deceased cartographer known for reliable work. He created multiple versions of the map, a detailed master chart, and simplified Portolan-style copies, exactly as the Casa de India would produce for actual discoveries. But the cartographic illusion was only the first layer. Rué understood that a map alone wouldn't be enough. People would ask questions. They would demand evidence. So Rué manufactured evidence. He paid Arab traders in Lisbon's waterfront markets to confirm they had heard stories of mid-Atlantic islands rich in aromatic plants. He acquired samples of cloves and nutmeg from Indian Ocean merchants and claimed they were specimens from the new islands, slightly different in appearance from Moluccan varieties. He forged a letter supposedly written by a Franciscan missionary who claimed to have visited the islands and ministered to a small population of converted Muslims. Each piece of supporting evidence was plausible individually. Together, they created a web of corroboration that felt overwhelming. The map was ready. The evidence was assembled. Now Rué needed buyers. Not just any buyers. He needed investors wealthy enough to fund an expedition, but desperate enough to take a risk. He needed believers. Rué didn't approach the crown directly. That would have invited scrutiny from royal cartographers who might recognize his techniques. Instead, he targeted Lisbon's merchant elite, men who had made fortunes in the spice trade, but now faced shrinking margins as the Indian Ocean route became saturated with competitors. He presented the map to a syndicate of 3 investors: a textile merchant whose ships had recently been lost in a storm, a minor nobleman seeking to restore his family's wealth, and a banker who specialized in high-risk ventures. Rué's pitch was elegant. Portugal's eastern spice route was profitable but overcrowded. The voyage to the Moluccas took 2 years and required passage through hostile waters. But these new islands, the Ilhas das Especiarias, were close. 3 weeks outbound, 3 weeks return. Low risk, high reward. A monopoly on an untapped source of cloves and nutmeg. The merchants were skeptical at first. Why hadn't these islands been discovered before? Rué had an answer. They had been, decades earlier, but the knowledge was lost when the pilot died. The islands were difficult to spot, low-lying, often shrouded in fog, and they lay in a region most Portuguese ships avoided because it was outside the direct route to Africa or Brazil. Rué claimed he had reconstructed their location from fragmentary notes and cross-referenced Arab trading records. The merchant syndicate conducted due diligence. They consulted with other traders, who confirmed that Arab merchants sometimes spoke of mysterious Atlantic islands. They examined the plant specimens Rué provided and confirmed they resembled genuine spices. They hired a second cartographer to review Rué's map. The cartographer, chosen carefully by Rué for his lack of experience with royal charts, declared it authentic. The syndicate was convinced. They proposed forming a joint stock company, the Companhia das Ilhas das Especiarias. Rué would receive a 15% stake in exchange for exclusive rights to his map and navigation data. The company would raise additional capital by selling shares to other investors. And crucially, they would petition the crown for a royal charter granting them monopoly trading rights to the islands. This was the moment when Rué's scheme transcended simple fraud and became a systemic event. The company issued a prospectus describing the islands, the expected profits, and the strategic advantage they would give Portugal over Spain. Shares sold quickly. Minor nobles bought in. Wealthy merchants bought in. Even church officials bought in, seeing an opportunity to fund missionary work. Within 3 months, the company had raised 200,000 cruzados, equivalent to the cost of equipping a major expedition to India. Now the trap was set. The company had money. It had investors. It had public credibility. All it needed was royal approval, and Rué knew exactly how to get it. The Portuguese crown in 1516 was under immense geopolitical pressure. Spain, under Charles V, was consolidating power. The Treaty of Tordesillas had theoretically divided the world, but its anti-meridian in the Pacific remained disputed. Spain was funding expeditions to find western routes to the Spice Islands, threatening Portugal's monopoly. Any strategic advantage was worth pursuing. When the Companhia das Ilhas das Especiarias petitioned King Manuel I for a royal charter, they framed the request in terms of national interest. The islands, they argued, clearly fell on Portugal's side of the Tordesillas line. Establishing a settlement there would strengthen Portugal's Atlantic claims and provide a way station for ships traveling to Brazil. It would generate tax revenue for the crown, and it would humiliate Spain by demonstrating Portugal's continued dominance in the spice trade. The crown's advisors reviewed the petition. They examined Rué's map. They consulted with the Casa de India. And here Rué's earlier disgrace became an asset. Because he was no longer officially affiliated with royal cartography, his map appeared to be an independent discovery rather than state-sponsored propaganda. It seemed more credible precisely because it hadn't originated within the crown bureaucracy. There was resistance. One senior navigator, a man who had sailed the Atlantic for 30 years, studied Rué's map and declared it impossible. The ocean currents, he argued, didn't support the existence of islands at that latitude. The wind patterns were wrong. The depth soundings didn't match known Atlantic bathymetry. He urged the crown to reject the charter. But the navigator was old, his methods considered outdated. The younger generation of merchants and nobles dismissed his objections as the caution of a man clinging to obsolete knowledge. After all, hadn't Portugal's success been built on challenging conventional wisdom? Hadn't Columbus been dismissed as a fool before proving the skeptics wrong? The psychological momentum favored belief, not doubt. King Manuel faced a choice. He could reject the charter, anger powerful merchants, and risk missing a genuine opportunity. Or he could grant it, collect taxes from the venture, and let private capital bear the risk. The decision was easy. In June 1517, the crown issued a royal charter granting the Companhia das Ilhas das Especiarias exclusive trading rights to the islands for 20 years. The company was authorized to establish a settlement, govern the islands, and exclude all rival Portuguese and foreign traders. Ruí de Freitas had just received the crown's blessing for a lie. Once the royal charter was issued, the fraud gained unstoppable momentum. The charter itself became evidence. If the king endorsed the venture, surely the islands were real. More investors bought shares. The company's valuation soared. Rué quietly sold half his stake, converting his paper wealth into gold and property. The company began preparing an expedition. They commissioned 3 ships, hired experienced pilots, and recruited colonists, farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, and priests. The expedition's commander was a respected captain who had sailed to India twice. He studied Rué's map carefully, memorizing the coordinates and navigation instructions. Rué, meanwhile, continued to manufacture evidence. When investors grew anxious about the timeline, he produced additional documents, a purported contract between Portuguese traders and island chieftains, a sketch of the island's harbor supposedly drawn by the deceased pilot, even a small wooden carving he claimed was an indigenous artifact. Each forgery deepened the company's commitment. Each lie made the truth harder to admit. Spanish spies got wind of the venture. They assumed, naturally, that the islands were real and that Portugal was attempting to establish a new Atlantic foothold in violation of Tordesillas. Spain lodged a diplomatic protest. This, perversely, reinforced Portuguese confidence. If Spain was worried, the islands must be valuable. Rué's scheme had achieved something remarkable. It had created a reality distortion field where everyone's incentives aligned with belief. Investors needed the islands to exist to recoup their money. The crown needed them to exist to justify the charter. The expedition members needed them to exist to avoid looking like fools. Even the skeptics had been marginalized. Doubt became treasonous. Questioning the islands meant questioning the king's judgment. By the time the expedition set sail in March 1518, Ruí de Freitas had transformed a cartographic fiction into an institutional fact. The only thing left was for reality to catch up. And reality, as always, was unforgiving. The expedition departed Lisbon with great fanfare. Priests blessed the ships. The company's investors lined the docks, waving handkerchiefs. The king sent a personal message wishing the expedition success. The three vessels, the São Miguel, the Santa Clara, and the Nossa Senhora de Conceição, carried 240 men, along with livestock, seeds, tools, and trade goods. The commander followed Rué's navigational instructions precisely. They sailed southwest from Lisbon, caught the prevailing westerlies, and proceeded to the coordinates specified on the map. 38 degrees north, approximately 45 degrees west. The voyage took 18 days. Weather was favorable. Morale was high. The men scanned the horizon for the first glimpse of the Ilhas das Especiarias. They found nothing. The commander ordered the fleet to search a 100-mile radius around the supposed location. They found nothing. He expanded the search to 200 miles. Nothing. The pilots recalculated their position using celestial navigation. The coordinates were correct. They were exactly where Rué's map said the island should be. But there was only open ocean. For 2 weeks, the ships crisscrossed the empty Atlantic. Sailors grew anxious. Supplies dwindled. The commander consulted Rué's map again and again, searching for an error in his calculations. Perhaps they had miscounted the leagues. Perhaps the latitude was slightly off. Perhaps the islands were low-lying and hidden by weather. But deep down, the commander knew the truth. There were no islands. There never had been. They had been deceived. The expedition turned back in late April 1518, arriving in Lisbon in mid-May. They had been gone less than 2 months. They returned with nothing. No spices, no settlements, no discoveries. Just the humiliating knowledge that they had been fooled. The company's investors convened an emergency meeting. The commander presented his findings. He showed them the navigation logs, the measurements, the search patterns. He declared unequivocally that the islands did not exist. The investors were stunned. How was this possible? The map had been authenticated. The crown had issued a charter. Spanish diplomats had protested. Arab traders had confirmed the stories. The evidence had been overwhelming. But now, piece by piece, the fraud unraveled. The Arab traders were questioned again. Under pressure, they admitted Rué had paid them to corroborate his story. The plant specimens were re-examined. They were genuine Moluccan spices, not from a news source. The forged documents were scrutinized by royal archivists, who identified anachronistic language and impossible signatures. The missionary's letter was traced to a scriptorium where Rué had purchased blank parchment. The map itself, once seen as proof, now became evidence of deception. Experts noted that Rué had used cartographic techniques only someone trained in the Casa de India would know. The precision of the forgery was itself the tell. No independent cartographer would have access to the specific drafting methods and authentication markers Rué had employed. The mechanism was suddenly visible. Rué had exploited the gap between plausibility and verification. He had weaponized the era's incomplete geographic knowledge, the institutional biases toward belief, and the economic incentives that rewarded optimism over skepticism. He had built a lie so sophisticated that it required an expensive expedition to disprove. and he was gone. The Companhia das Ilhas das Especiarias collapsed within days. Share values plummeted. Investors lost fortunes. The three founding merchants faced bankruptcy. Minor nobles who had bought shares saw their family wealth evaporate. Church officials who had invested church funds faced accusations of financial mismanagement. The crown was humiliated. King Manuel had issued a royal charter endorsing a fraud. Spain mocked Portugal's gullibility, using the incident as diplomatic leverage in ongoing Tordesillas disputes. The king ordered an investigation. Arrest warrants were issued for Ruí de Freitas, but he had vanished. The old navigator who had initially warned against the expedition was vindicated but took no pleasure in it. His expertise had been dismissed as obsolete. Now, belatedly, his judgment was recognized, but the damage was done. Trust in Portuguese cartography was shaken. Future expeditions faced heightened skepticism from investors. The Crown imposed stricter authentication requirements on all geographic claims. Ruí's fraud had exposed a systemic vulnerability. The Portuguese maritime system, for all its sophistication, had been built on trust. Verification was expensive and time-consuming. Belief was cheap and immediate. Ruí had shown that this asymmetry could be exploited by anyone with the right expertise and the wrong motives. But where was Ruí? And what did he do with his ill-gotten gains? Ruí de Freitas had not fled Portugal on impulse. He had planned his exit months in advance, before the expedition even sailed. Using the gold he had obtained from selling his company's shares, he purchased a new identity from a Flemish document forger. He became Rodrigo Fernandez, a Castilian merchant originally from Seville. Crucially, Ruí had created one final map before vanishing. This one was genuine. It was a comprehensive chart of the African coast, compiled from years of data he had collected during his time at the Casa de India. It included information Portugal had never made public: safe harbors, reef locations, trade wind patterns, diplomatic contacts with coastal African kingdoms. It was a masterpiece of real cartography, the kind of knowledge that foreign powers would pay handsomely to acquire. Ruí took this map to Spain. Using his false identity, he approached the court of Charles V and offered his services as a cartographic consultant. The Spanish, still smarting from their rivalry with Portugal and intrigued by his apparent expertise, hired him. Ruí, now Rodrigo, spent the next decade quietly feeding Spanish navigators information about Portuguese trade routes. But he never revealed his true identity. He never told the Spanish about the Ilhas das Especiarias fraud. That secret, he knew, would make him a liability. Instead, he built a second career as a respectable Spanish cartographer, producing maps that were accurate, valuable, and entirely legitimate. He had learned his lesson. One masterpiece fraud was enough for a lifetime. Everything afterward was honest work. The Ilhas das Especiarias never appeared on official Portuguese maps. The Casa de India issued an internal directive prohibiting any reference to them. It was as if the islands had never been proposed. But the institutional memory lingered. Cartographers became paranoid. Every new discovery was questioned. Explorers returning with reports of uncharted islands faced intense interrogation. The burden of proof shifted dramatically. It was no longer sufficient to present a map and supporting testimony. Physical samples, multiple corroborating witnesses, and repeat voyages became mandatory. This heightened skepticism had unintended consequences. Some legitimate discoveries were initially rejected because they seemed too convenient. The psychological pendulum swung from credulity to paranoia. The Portuguese maritime system, once dangerously trusting, became dangerously cynical. But the deeper legacy was this. Ruí had demonstrated that in an era of incomplete information, the appearance of knowledge was as powerful as knowledge itself. A sufficiently skilled liar could manipulate institutional systems designed to uncover truth. The mechanisms that made exploration possible, the reliance on secondhand reports, the economic pressures to believe, the geopolitical incentives to claim territory, were the same mechanisms that made fraud possible. Ruí's fraud was not unique. Phantom islands had appeared on maps for centuries, though most were honest mistakes rather than deliberate deceptions. Antillia persisted on charts for decades because no one could afford to verify its non-existence. Frisland remained on maps because cartographers copied from other cartographers without independent verification. But Ruí's case revealed something more troubling. What if Phantom Islands weren't just errors? What if some were profitable fictions, created by people who understood exactly how systems of verification worked and how to circumvent them? The historical record offers hints. Several other discoveries from the early 16th century suspiciously disappeared from later maps with no explanation. Were they honest mistakes? Or were they frauds that succeeded briefly before being exposed? The question became not whether the system could be gamed, but how often it was. And the answer was more often than anyone wanted to admit. The pattern Ruí de Freitas exploited: manufacturing evidence, exploiting institutional trust, profiting from verification gaps, did not end with the age of exploration. It repeated throughout history, in different contexts, with different protagonists, but the same fundamental structure. In 1925, a Portuguese man named Artur Virgílio Alves dos Reis orchestrated the largest financial fraud in Portugal's history. Like Ruí, Alves dos Reis understood systems from inside. He forged documents purporting to authorize the printing of legitimate Portuguese banknotes. He convinced a London printing company to produce 580,500 escudo notes, nearly half of Portugal's money supply. The notes were genuine in every technical sense. They were printed by the official manufacturer using official plates. The only problem was that the authorization was fake. Alves dos Reis founded a bank, the Banco Angola e Metropole, to launder his counterfeit currency. He granted loans at favorable rates, stimulated the Portuguese economy, and was hailed as a financial genius. The fraud succeeded for months because everyone's incentives aligned with belief. Banks wanted the deposits. Borrowers wanted the credit. The government welcomed the economic stimulus. Verification was delayed until someone finally noticed duplicate serial numbers on banknotes. The parallel to Ruí's cartographic fraud is striking. Both men exploited the gap between appearance and verification. Both created authentic forgeries that passed institutional scrutiny. Both profited by understanding that systems designed to prevent fraud often relied on trust at critical junctures. In both cases revealed that sophisticated fraud doesn't require bypassing security. It requires knowing how security works and mimicking it perfectly. In 1965, the Vinland map appeared, purporting to show Viking exploration of North America a century before Columbus. It was subjected to extensive scholarly analysis. Experts declared it authentic. Yale University acquired it. A book was published celebrating its significance. But decades later, scientific testing revealed it was a 20th century forgery. The forger had understood medieval cartographic conventions well enough to fool historians for years. The pattern repeats. Knowledge systems are vulnerable to insiders or skilled outsiders who understand their verification mechanisms. The more sophisticated the system, the more sophisticated the fraud must be. But sophistication alone doesn't prevent deception. Sometimes it enables it. The pattern repeats because of structural asymmetry between fabrication and verification. Creating a plausible falsehood requires only skill and motivation. Disproving it requires resources, time, and often the willingness to confront institutional embarrassment. In Ruí's case, creating the fraudulent map took months of skilled labor. Disproving it required an expensive 2-month ocean expedition. The cost asymmetry favored the fraud, and this asymmetry exists in many domains. Financial fraud succeeds because verification is expensive. Alves dos Reis's counterfeit currency circulated for months because systematic checking of serial numbers across thousands of banks was impractical. The fraud was only discovered accidentally when a bank teller happened to notice duplicate numbers on 2 bills presented simultaneously. Academic fraud succeeds because replication is tedious. The Vinland map fooled experts because radiocarbon dating was expensive and potentially destructive. Only decades later, when non-destructive testing improved, was the forgery conclusively proven. The underlying problem is incentive misalignment. Those who benefit from a falsehood have strong motivation to defend it. Those who might expose it often have weak incentives to invest the resources required. Companies don't eagerly fund investigations that might reveal they were defrauded. Institutions don't volunteer to admit they authenticated forgeries. Investors don't demand refunds that might trigger bankruptcies. This creates an environment where fraud, once established, becomes self-reinforcing. Admitting deception means admitting gullibility. Acknowledging a fake means acknowledging failed systems. So there's institutional pressure to sustain the fiction as long as possible. The mechanisms that enabled Ruí de Freitas' cartographic fraud in 1516 are still operational. The domains have changed: finance, technology, credentials, scientific publishing, but the underlying dynamics remain. Consider startup fraud in the 21st century. Companies present compelling narratives, impressive credentials, and sophisticated technical documentation. Investors conduct due diligence, consulting experts and reviewing materials. But the verification process often relies on trust at critical junctures. Are the user numbers accurate? Are the technical claims feasible? Is the CEO's background truthfully represented? The cost of thorough verification often exceeds investors' willingness to pay for it. So sophisticated frauds can succeed for years before collapsing. Or consider credential fraud. Alves dos Reis forged an engineering diploma from Oxford to establish credibility. The forgery succeeded because verification was difficult in the early 20th century. But even today, credential mills and fake degrees thrive. Background checks catch obvious frauds, but sophisticated fakes, doctored transcripts, fake accreditation bodies, fabricated employment histories can slip through. The fundamental insight is this: systems built on trust are vulnerable to skilled liars. And the more complex the system, the more points of vulnerability exist. Ruí exploited Portuguese maritime institutions at the moment when they were expanding rapidly, when geographic knowledge was fragmentary, when economic pressures favored belief over skepticism. Those same conditions, rapid expansion, incomplete information, economic incentives for optimism, recur constantly in modern contexts. The Ilhas das Especiarias fraud matters today because it's a template. It shows how rational actors, following reasonable procedures, can be systematically deceived by someone who understands their decision-making processes. It demonstrates that fraud doesn't require conspiracy or corruption. It requires only asymmetric knowledge and misaligned incentives. Ruí de Freitas, living as Rodrigo Fernandes, died in 1547 in Seville. He was 63 years old. He had spent 30 years working as a respected Spanish cartographer. His maps of the African coast and the Caribbean were used by Spanish expeditions for decades. He died comfortably, survived by a wife and 2 children who never learned his original identity. His Portuguese fraud was never officially solved. The Crown's investigation concluded that the Companhia das Ilhas das Especiarias had been deceived by a talented forger, but they never identified Ruí as the culprit. His disappearance remained a mystery. Some speculated he had died at sea. Others thought he had fled to the New World. A few suspected the truth, that he had adopted a false identity and continued working elsewhere, but no proof ever emerged. The investors ruined by the fraud never recovered their losses. The Companhia dissolved. The royal charter was revoked. The 3 founding merchants spent years in legal battles, trying to recoup fragments of their investments. None succeeded. The episode became a cautionary tale whispered among Lisbon's merchant elite. Be wary of maps too beautiful to be true. The story of Ruí de Freitas and his phantom islands reveals something fundamental about how knowledge systems operate. We imagine that truth-seeking institutions, scientific bodies, financial regulators, legal systems are robust against deception. But they're not. They're robust against obvious deception. Sophisticated deception, executed by insiders or by outsiders with insider knowledge, can exploit the very mechanisms designed to ensure reliability. Maps were supposed to be objective representations of reality. But maps were always constructed by humans with motivations, biases, and limited information. The cartographer's authority derived from expertise, but that same expertise enabled forgery. The verification processes, peer review by other cartographers, authentication by royal officials, assumed good faith. Ruí demonstrated what happens when that assumption is violated by someone skilled enough to mimic legitimacy. This is not a story about individual villainy. Ruí was motivated by revenge and greed. Yes, but his fraud succeeded because the system was structurally vulnerable. The Portuguese maritime empire relied on incomplete information, economic pressures for rapid expansion, and geopolitical competition that rewarded belief over caution. Ruí didn't create those vulnerabilities. He simply recognized and exploited them. The deeper lesson is about epistemic humility. We know less than we think we know. The confidence with which institutions proclaim truth often exceeds the reliability of their verification processes. Ruí's map was authenticated by experts, endorsed by the crown, and defended by investors. Everyone involved had good reasons to believe, and everyone was wrong. De Ilhas das Especiarias never existed. But for 18 months, from the moment Ruí presented his map to the moment the expedition returned empty-handed, they were real in every way that mattered. They appeared on maps. Investors bought shares in their exploitation. The Crown issued legal documents governing them. Spain protested their discovery. They shaped decisions, motivated actions, and altered outcomes. This raises an uncomfortable question. How many other fictions are we treating as facts right now? Not obvious falsehoods, not conspiracy theories or propaganda, but sophisticated fabrications embedded within legitimate systems, defended by credible institutions, supported by apparently reliable evidence. Fictions that will only be exposed when someone finally pays the cost of verification and discovers nothing where something was supposed to be. Ruí de Freitas created phantom islands on a map. But the more profound fraud was persuading an entire system to navigate by them. The ships sailed west. The investors committed capital. The crown granted authority. All based on ink and vellum and the assumption that expertise implies honesty. We like to think we've moved beyond such vulnerabilities. That modern verification systems are too robust to be fooled. But the pattern suggests otherwise. Fraud evolves with verification. The more sophisticated our systems, the more sophisticated the deceptions they enable. So perhaps the question isn't whether phantom islands still exist on our maps. Perhaps the question is, which ones are we sailing toward right now?